Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third panel of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies online series, Decolonising Europe. My name is Beste İşleyen, and together with my colleague Tasnim Anwar, I'm the co-convener of this series. We are based at the University of Amsterdam in the Department of Political Science. We are extremely happy to welcome today two distinguished speakers to rethink European-Ottoman relations through the topics of Islam, democracy, and capitalism. Our first speaker is Senem Aydın-Düzgit, who is a professor of international relations in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science of Sabancı University. Senem is senior scholar and research and academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center. Her work focuses on European foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, EU-Turkey relations, discourse analysis, and identity in international relations, especially European foreign policy. Our second speaker is Cemal Burak Tansel, who is lecturer of international politics in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Burak works on the historical sociology of state formation and capitalist development in the Middle East and the political economy of development. Welcome, Senem and Burak. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Beste. Thanks for the invitation.
So a few words on the format. So this will be a 1-hour event. We will spend the next 35 minutes having a conversation between the two panelists, moderated through topics. This will be followed by a Q&A session. Those who are in the audience, you can use the chat box function of the software to send us your questions and make statements. And we are happy to see in the previous two events that people were also sharing some suggestions for books and even movies. So we are extremely happy that these online series have also provided a platform for this lively exchange of ideas. And one final remark, as you know, this session is recorded and the edited video will be uploaded on the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Center for Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. So I want to kick off our conversation with a broad question. So Senem and Burak, in your recent research, both of you have challenged the ways in which European-Ottoman relations have so far been studied. So what motivated you in your scholarly work? And in Senem's case, it's the topic of Islam and democracy, and Burak works on Islam, capitalism and the origins of capitalism. So my question is, can you explain a bit what puzzle and question has motivated you? What was the starting point of your research? Senem?
Thank you very much, Beste Jim, and thank you so much for the invitation again. It's a pleasure to be here in the company of such excellent colleagues. What motivated me is, well, I mean, I can take it all the back to my own PhD research when I was working on, many years ago, on the construction of European identity through EU's foreign policy, through EU's enlargement policy, where I came across, at the time, so many references to Turkey being a model state to the Middle East, to North African countries, at various different parts in European history. So this discourse was dominant, and at the time I had noticed that this discourse was very closely related to certain conceptions of a relationship between Islam, democracy, and also secularism. Now, I was so that was there, and then many years after, we embarked on a Horizon 2020 project on European-Turkish relations. And in that project, we were responsible for, together with my colleague Bahar Rumelili from Koç University, we were responsible for the work package on identity representations between Europe and Turkey. And when we were doing that, we wanted that work package to be about, you know, what we really wanted to study, rather than just doing something for the sake of the project as well. And we were both interested and also complaining about the fact that there wasn't really many longue durée studies that looked at the longue durée representations, reciprocal representations of the Ottomans and the Europeans. Ottomans and European powers. So that is what we embarked on doing. And in doing that project, what we did is that we chose specific events from late 19th century onwards, around which identity representations were articulated on both sides. And one of those events was the abolition of the Caliphate in Turkey back in 1924. And that event surprised us considerably, because we were thinking, also not being historians ourselves, that in Europe there would have been some kind of, at least, certain degree of endorsement that Turkey was now abolishing the Caliphate, on the grounds that it wanted to be a European country, on the grounds that it wanted to be a more modern country, etc., etc. But what we actually observed in the European discourses was something to the contrary, that mostly European powers were very unhappy, were very unpleased with the abolition of the Caliphate, because they thought that this was one way through which they could enjoy a certain degree of imposition and control over their colonies or former colonies, and thus they thought Turkey would be a good medium for that. And when we were looking into depth into those discourses, I realized that they were in fact very parallel, discursively speaking. I'm not talking about motivations or drivers, etc., but at a discursive level, that they run significant parallels with my more contemporary work on construction of Turkey as a model country. And in that sense, we thought of looking at those discursive parallels, and we wanted to look into those discursive patterns where we, in fact, did see important similarities in terms of the assumptions between Islam and democracy, in terms of assumptions regarding secularism, in the possibility of secularism in the Middle East and North Africa, and the role of Turkey in all of that.
Thank you, Senem. Burak, do you want to tell us what your starting point was?
Yeah, so let me start by thanking Beste and Tasnim once again. This is a great event, and I'm really, really delighted to be here. And it's also great to actually learn from Senem, and that answer was just fantastic. And now I'm going to sound really incoherent. So this is going to be a contrast compared to Senem's answer. I should probably start by apologizing to the attendees, because I did actually prepare some answers to Beste's questions. She circulated the questions in advance, but unfortunately I had a computer crash this morning, so I lost that document. So I'm just going to give you some really ad hoc, incoherent thoughts about some really serious and deep issues. I guess, even though you formulated the question as the origins of capitalism and how I came to it, my starting point was actually the modern state and state formation in the Middle East. That was the topic of my PhD research, and because I had my background in international relations, that was the main literature that I was engaging with in order to kind of unpack this question of how to historicize modern state formation in the Middle East. And I was using Turkey as a case study, and what became quite clear at the beginning was, obviously you need to grapple with the legacy of the Ottoman Empire in order to properly unpack the origins of the Republican states, both obviously discursively, as Senem mentioned, but also in terms of his kind of material trajectory. And as I was doing that research, again, it became kind of obvious to me that that process was actually quite closely related to the development of capitalism or capitalist social relations in the Middle East more generally. So those two puzzles became one for me, the puzzle of modern state formation on the one end and the puzzle of capitalism on the other end. And again, because my kind of focal point was the international relations literature, most of the work that I ended up engaging with in terms of the historical sociology of international relations, the work of people like, John Hobson, George Lawson, or Ben Oteschke, I learned a lot from how they actually conceptualize those kind of large-scale macro history questions, but I also found myself slightly puzzled and frustrated as to the absence of the Ottoman Empire from this entire framework of questions about the origins of the modern state system, but also the origins of modern economic developments throughout the world. So I kept digging more and more. I find myself kind of digging more into the historiography and other related disciplines, and moved away from IR, much to the, I think, chagrin of my supervisors at the time, who wanted me to kind of stay more focused on the IR literature. And that kind of conceptual question for me turned into an empirical one. I started analyzing the actual social relations that changed in the Ottoman Empire that had an impact on the development of the Republican state in Turkey. So the starting point was effectively, how do we unpack the question of modernity in materialist terms in the Middle East, and can we actually use the international relations literature as a medium to do that, or do we actually need other resources? Do we need other approaches and insights from other disciplines?
Yeah, thank you, Burak. And when you were elaborating what motivated you in your research, it's very much connects with the next question I want to ask you about some epistemological choices that you have made. But one of the commonalities in your research is that you are, for instance, calling for decentering research on Europe and Ottoman relations. Senem, you do it in the study of Islam and democracy, and Burak, you also point to the prevailing Eurocentric accounts of the origins of capitalism. You also point to the need for provincializing Europe. So my question is, what do we mean by these terms? So what is decentering Europe? What is provincializing Europe? What is a Eurocentric account of Euro-Ottoman relations? Can you maybe tell a bit more on this? Senem?
Yeah, sure, of course. I mean, this decentering European studies or decentering European foreign policy discourse, that's been around for a while now. And I think to understand how it emerged, one has to look at the general trends or developments in international relations literature, as Burak was also mentioning, and how, history and especially historical sociological approaches also became a bit more prominent in the last decade or so, maybe, especially in terms of critical history, of course, and historiography. Now, so basically, when you call for decentering European studies as such, there are various dimensions to that. I mean, I think one of the most first articles or first calls for such decentering was the Fisher and Nicolaidis article in 2013 article on how can we study Europe while decentering it, basically. Can we introduce a new theoretical agenda to that? And there, what they were calling is that, tackling deep-rooted Eurocentric narratives in studies of European integration, but also foreign policy, including the perspective of others, those who've been excluded, those who've been marginalized, and basically try to not just, as in critical historiography, you don't just study the history of it, but you also intervene and engage as a critical scholar and reconstruct by including the voices of those that have been excluded from the narrative making process, and you reconstruct basically by respect, neutrality, and local empowerment, etc. So that was mostly the call, and there have been some sort of theoretical attempts to refine that or to deepen those first calls, and there have been some empirical studies as well. So I would say that this is a field in the context of European studies that still has some way to go, right? So that is still emerging. I mean, we have some works in the pipeline, but I know that others do as well. And there are, in many ways, they require an engagement with local agency, because one thing that I've also observed in my own work is that, for instance, in the model discourse, which we just mentioned, yes, I mean, one way of decentering is to look at how that discourse is imbued with all kinds of neo-colonial and neo-Orientalist assumptions. But another way in which this discourse is possible is because this discourse was mainly articulated in the West and also by Turkish foreign policymakers without really looking at the local agency and without really focusing on how this country was perceived, how the Turkish experience was really discussed by different local actors. And when you go into depth with it and do that, and which is what I'm doing for another project with other colleagues from Maastricht, is that, well, we see that no, this discourse was never received uniformly in, let's say, a country like Egypt or in Tunisia. It had very minimal effect, and it was heavily contested, even by the Muslim Brotherhood and those political parties that assumedly look more towards the AKP experience in Turkey, etc. So local agency, I think, is an important part of it. But, and seeing the discursive continuities is another part of it, including the voices of those who are excluded is another part of it. So you have various theoretical and, in my opinion, practical dimensions of this decentering agenda that still needs work on, and that still needs to be brought together. Because unless you do that, we see that many of these claims or analysis cannot just, I mean, you can say that they're normatively problematic at some level, but they also pose problems from a practical sense as well, in terms of actual policy making, in terms of what flies and what doesn't, what is effective and what is not.
Thank you, Senem. Burak?
Yeah, it's a great question and something that I've been pondering quite a lot, especially recently. So for me, again, this is largely an empirical question, actually, because the way in which especially the international relations literature has studied the state system or global economy or capitalist economy, etc., because they relied so much on taking a very kind of particular trajectory and experience of Europe as its archetype, it has meant that all of the concepts that they created, well, maybe not all, but most of the concepts they created and most of the approaches they developed, they've been basically tied too closely to that specific historical encounter. So this creates empirical issues for people like us who are trying to study what it means to have capitalist development in the Middle East. Because if you're trying to take on the same approaches and same let's say epistemologies, we can't really grapple with some of the kind of, let's say, points of contention that arise from that historical records. So at least in my research, what I try to do is not necessarily to say the European encounter is not important or the European experience is not important, we should just ignore it, but we should actually try to incorporate the experiences of the other parts of the world, especially in relation to how they were incorporated into capitalist system, so that we can actually understand capitalist world economy better. So for me, provincializing Europe actually means we get to have more useful, more productive empirical and conceptual accounts of the global economy and international system as a whole. So it's not just about recognizing the Ottoman agency or the Turkish agency. It's not just about saying, the other countries and other societies did important things. It's actually about recognizing what those contributions meant for the entire international system as a whole. So when sometimes, people, let's say, more skeptical or more critical accounts of Eurocentrism, sometimes they pose this question and they say, why do you want to actually bring in Middle Eastern actors into the origins of capitalism? Capitalism is a uniquely European sin almost. So other people shouldn't actually be affiliated with that sin. Let's kind of make sure that they're not actually implicated in that horrible story of exploitation and oppression. And what I usually answer to that question is, or to that provocation is, well, if you don't actually include people from the global south and societies from the global south in that story, your story is incomplete. So you're actually just telling one aspect, one fraction of a larger story, and your version is actually not accurate because it ignores so much of what is relevant to that broader story. So to me, it's not decentering or provincializing Europe is not something that you can just do in one article or in one book. I think, as Senem mentioned, it has to be understood as part of a broader project, and that's why I think the current discussions around decolonization are incredibly important to the social sciences, because they raise the importance of seeing this as a foundational kind of rethinking and reconstruction of our approaches. So, if anyone's interested in decentering Europe from the study of something, I think they should see it as a long-term objective rather than something they can do in the kind of constraints of an article or even a book.
Yeah, thank you, Burak. And while you were answering the question, I was also thinking that a decolonial agenda is not only about adding and stirring, right? It's not only about bringing the narratives of previously maybe invisible actors into the debate. It is about also reconstructing, let's say, reconstructing what we know about the past as well. And Burak, while we were answering the question, I also find a lot of connections between your research and Bambra's concept of connected histories. So you also mention it also in your own research, but you also specifically call, Burak, for a different theoretical approach to study the origins of capitalism. And I want to also you to elaborate a little bit more on the need for maybe moving beyond prevailing conceptual frameworks to really understand these connected histories in our study of capitalism. Can you maybe answer this first?
Sure, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Gurminder Bambra's work has been a huge influence from the get-go. And if anyone's interested in actually reading an account that comes from a sociological background but still grapples with IR questions, you should go and read her Millennium article, I think it was 2010, on Marxist historical sociology in international relations. So Gurminder's own work, I think, has been also partially influenced by the work of South Asian historians like Subramanian, who came up with the term connected histories. And I think for me, the way I take from that concept is the importance of, again, understanding these global developments, not only as events or specific encounters, but actually processes that span pretty much centuries, not necessarily years or decades. And within those stories, we need to recognize how mutually constitutive interactions between different parts of the world actually created the structures and agents that we recognize in the global economy and international system today. So my criticism of particularly the Marxist camp of historical sociology literature was, even though I identify myself as a historical materialist, I wrote a, let's say, comradely critique, and I told my colleagues that they were still focusing too much on the European experience as this archetype of capitalist development. So European capitalism effectively becomes capitalism writ large. And my point was, you could actually write a more, first of all, accurate and I think productive historical account if you can actually incorporate some of these marginalized and ignored cases from the global south. And I tried to do that with focusing on the 19th century Ottoman encounter. So sometimes that is kind of recognized as a defensive modernization movements that emerge in response to European developments. And I try to show by looking at the transformation of the Ottoman landholding system, how it was partially, the whole reform movement and Tanzimat, yes, it was partially a response to the European dominance, but it was also a product of existing changes that were happening in the Ottoman social relations, which started centuries before Europe actually became this kind of center of attention and political power. And to conceptualize that, I suggested that maybe we can talk about capitalism not as this singular monolithic concept, but we can actually talk about capitalism as a mode of production, which is the capitalism of Marx that we can recognize today. And we can talk about the historical capitalism that incorporated some of the elements of capitalist social relations that we recognize today, but didn't necessarily bring everything together as a system. So you can talk about the kind of manifestation of capitalistic social relations in the Ottoman Empire prior to the 19th century. That doesn't mean that Ottoman Empire was a capitalist society before 19th century or even after the 19th century, but it actually allows you to recognize how those social relations were already in the process of being developed and being created, partially as a response to the European encounter and European interventions, but also sometimes because of internal politics and internal developments. So, you know, that is, I think that's part of a broader conversation we need to have in the international relations literature, in terms of how we're blackboxing the states, how we're not paying attention to what is happening within societies and states because of our kind of privilege focus on the international. But my contribution was a really kind of surgical intervention into a specific literature, particularly the historical materials literature. And I just tried to raise awareness about these other ways of thinking about capitalism that do not really relegate the rest of the world to a footnote, basically, in the grand history of capitalist developments.
Yeah, thank you, Burak. You made a very important point about the significance of historical accounts in the contextualization of Euro-Ottoman relations. And I want to ask Senem, because you also call for bringing colonialism and Orientalism in our study of how Europe approaches Islam and democracy in its relations with Turkey. Can you maybe say a bit more on why colonialism and Orientalism are important?
Before I do that, can I just say a few things about this notion of history and this interconnected stories, if I may? Because I think there's an important point there that's also been made by Burak, and I see that in the questions and answers it's been mentioned as well. So I thought I might also touch upon that right now, since it's very relevant to what you've both been saying. So you see, I'm following them, I'm listening to him, I'm trying to combine them all. Well, basically, here is the thing. I mean, you can't, when we're talking about, as you said rightly, Beste, incorporating the voices of the marginalized or coming up with alternative narratives, reconstructing, etc., etc., we have to keep in mind that we cannot just incorporate post-Orientalist historical narrative and just say, okay, this is it, you know, this is how we're decentering, or etc., and this is enough for the purpose of, you know, unsettling the discipline's Eurocentric assumptions, basically. Now, I think this is just not sufficient. What needs to be done, I think, in my opinion, for the decentering agenda, and especially in the contemporary world that we're living in, and in line with the developments that we're going through in the post-Western world, in terms of rising populism, authoritarianism, etc. I mean, not just in the post-Western world. In the West, of course, we see the rise of those as well. But what you see is that how these so-called certain historical accounts as such are used to make certain claims to political identity in the present. So if we're going to engage with critical historiography in studying these, then we have to look at the so-called truths, identities, and hierarchies that are naturalized by the users of these. So in my opinion, an important part of the decentering agenda should be to look at, underline, to see how these so-called non-Western agencies play a role in the historical constitution of the international. Yes, that is important, but we also need to look at how these analyses intersect with the political uses of history at the present. So you need to engage, I think, we need to engage more with contemporary political uses as well, in both the Western and non-Western context, to really counter the Eurocentrism of the discipline, because otherwise you run the trap of, you know, lending support to, you know, many of those identity-based or so-called normative claims of these authoritarian powers and leaders, which is sometimes done under the broader rubric of global IR, you know. So I, for instance, have I've always had certain doubts and question marks about this claim to global IR, and this is the exact reason why I've had those doubts, right? Because under the sort of larger umbrella of global IR, it's very easy to sort of swift and shift to that position where you use and abuse IR theory to lend support to your claim to an authoritarian identity, to your claim to hegemonize a certain identity at home. So if you're talking about decentering, and if you're worried about how you can include the voices of those marginalized without lending support to authoritarian leaders and movements that claim to be the representative of those voices, I think this is where you should engage with as a critical scholar.
I guess this was an answer to Nora's question.
Yeah, I saw that, but I mean, I could respond to it later, I know, but since this is so much sort of, it fits with what you've said and what Burak said, I thought I should just chip in. So I'm sorry.
Nora is a loyal member in the audience of these online series. We are always
she's a good friend
in the audience. So. Yeah, but can you maybe?
I might have privileged her somehow. I'm sorry.
About the issue of Orientalism, can you maybe say?
Okay, let's come back to that. Okay. All right. So the importance of Orientalism, right? You said, or colonialism and
Orientalism.
Okay, well, I mean, what it does is that on the one hand, the Orientalist discourse mirrors the non-West or whatever is happening in the West through a certain lens, right? Through a certain Western-oriented, Eurocentric lens where it wishes to see it that way. And what it also does, and this links into my previous argument, so I don't think these two are connected, it also helps to gloss over. So it ascribes the country, like for instance in the Turkish case, it ascribes it to this identity, even in the abolition of the Caliphate discourse, right? That you're not Western, you're not European because you're Islamic, you're this and that, you're not civilized enough, you're not one of us. But having said that, you have the Caliphate, that's good. We exert a certain control over it because they might listen to you because of the Caliphate, right? And we like that. So you're good for manipulation and control and a certain degree of subordination, right? And that is the Eurocentric, manipulative, and Orientalist dimension of it. So, and on top of that, what it does is that it helps the West to gloss over any kind of authoritarianism or violation of human rights, etc. to a significant extent, right? So the Orientalist lens not only misreads in some ways or excludes in some ways whatever's happening on the ground, but it also glosses over, practically speaking and normatively speaking again, certain authoritarian developments or violations of fundamental freedoms or what have you, because it sees everything in that lens, right? This, for instance, is, in my opinion, exactly what's happened in the Turkish case, where nobody in the West criticized Turkish democracy until, God knows when, 2015 or something. We've been saying that for so many years. We've been speaking to so many people, even my colleagues who worked on European foreign policy, prominent colleagues of mine, who were just basically laughing when I was telling them things were about to get out of control just before the Gezi uprisings, right? Because for them, things are fine, things are okay. It's because you're not reading between the lines. It's because it's a certain lens, I think, which prevents you from seeing that, you're Islamic, this is good. You're good like this. You're good as a model like this. And I think that's very simplistic. And a critical research has to go right to the root of that. And if not just for normative terms, and if not just for the sake of academia, for the actual practical consequences in the actual world that we're living in for human lives.
Yeah, thank you, Senem. And our Q&A is about to start. Please send us your questions. Senem, and I want to follow up on this because you also say that there are discursive continuities between the past and the present when it comes to Europe's approach to Islam and democracy, with a specific example of the Arab Uprisings and Turkey's presentation as being a model for democracy. Can you maybe tell us a little bit on this? And maybe a similar question to Burak, are your insights into Eurocentric accounts of the origins of capitalism, are they also applicable to, let's say, to the academic studies of contemporary capitalism? Do you see also these discursive continuities?
Do you want me to start this there?
Whatever you prefer. Senem.
It's up to you. Okay, about the continuities, let me just say this out from the beginning because I think it's important. I mean, we're not making an anachronistic comparison with history here. I mean, you can understand that if you actually read our latest article, but in case people haven't, I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea and think we're just drawing certain anachronistic parallels about the motives and behaviors of actors. That is not what we're doing, because we know, and we do acknowledge, of course, the behavior of the European actors, their motivations, etc., the drivers have changed fundamentally in the last 100 years or so. That is not the issue. The issue here is this. Looking at, for instance, again, the case of the abolition of the Caliphate, what we see there when we read the original sort of excerpts and quotes from European powers, leaders, politicians at the time, that they are concerned. They are concerned that this will lead to public unrest and even revolts in British and French colonies in Middle East and North Africa. and that they need the caliphate to maintain stability and harmony among Muslim populations under colonial rule. That is why they're concerned. That is why they're not happy about it, right? They're not happy because it's going to undermine their control. That's what they're displeased about. And of course, it doesn't happen, right? Nobody in the Middle East and North Africa riots because the caliphate is abolished, right? So you see that it doesn't even result in that. So, but that kind of construction or that kind of representation in turn leads to a paradoxical construction of Turkey's Muslim identity, right? On the one hand, you have the strategic instrument of colonial control over the Middle East and North Africa as a major theme that's running. And also you still see Turkey as an obstacle for modernity and civilization, etc., because of this Islamic character. Now, run fast forward in the post-2000 Turkey as a model discourse. Again, what you see is the ascription of Islam as a primary identity over Middle East and North Africa, right? Turkey can be a model because it's Muslim, right? It's really being Muslim what differentiates all these countries and puts them in this one homogeneous monolithic block into one basket, basically, as an instrument of subordination and control, because it's through the Turkish model that these countries can, you know, stabilize themselves, can become more Western, more liberal in terms of their economy, in terms of their politics, etc., whatever, to some extent. And so they can be controlled, right? So there, again, you have a certain degree of concern about Western influence, European influence over this very diverse geography. Again, the same treatment of this whole entire geography as a homogeneous space, and again, with very little local agency and whatever they think about this whole model discourse. So I think the major continuity in terms of Orientalism and colonial discourse as well, when you look at it as such, is that.
Thank you, Senem. Burak?
Wow, great answer, Senem. Yeah, just making me think about other things, but they're not incredibly relevant, so I'm just going to try to stick to Beste's question. So I think in terms of the continuities, I think we should be careful not trying to transpose, like Senem said, these historical accounts onto contemporary politics, or we shouldn't try to create direct relations between the two, because I think that results in some great historical distortions and also politically really convenient tools for authoritarian regimes. So they can tap into historical events to kind of reinterpret or justify some of their own policies. So I'm always a bit hesitant when it comes to making these historical analogies. But at the same time, there are, I think, conceptual and empirical lessons we can take from, for example, how capitalism in the Middle East used to be studied in international relations and political economy. So, one dominant account of capitalist development in the Middle East was this idea that Middle East did not have organic kind of progressive bourgeoisies, and because of that, they didn't actually get to have this, organic capitalist developments. Capitalism had to be imported from the West. So if you read any Ottoman labor history or any, I think, recent political economy based scholarship around the Ottoman Empire, you would know that that was not necessarily true. Ottoman Empire did have a bourgeoisie. It was a non-Muslim bourgeoisie, but there was a bourgeoisie, and bourgeoisie acted the same way it acted in other parts of the world. But because the foundational account of the Ottoman capitalism and modernity was based on this idea that the empire didn't have a bourgeoisie, still some of the contemporary developments related to capitalism are being interpreted from the same kind of vantage points. So if you go back to 2013 around the Arab Uprisings, and if you look at some of the punditry and opinion pieces on why the Turkish middle classes were uprising at the time, you can see this kind of parallels between the absence of bourgeoisie in the Ottoman Empire and the absence of progressive bourgeoisie in modern Turkey. So some of those initial, let's say, imaginaries about what Ottoman economy looked like very much carried on and remained with us as concepts and frameworks. And they were used in the study of the modern Turkish economy and capitalist development as well. You can say the same thing about the role of the working classes. It used to be fashionable, not anymore thankfully, but it used to be fashionable to argue that, you know, there was no working class in the Ottoman Empire. There was no industrial working class in the Ottoman Empire. Again, we know that's not true because the labor historians have done, you know, amazing research basically refuting their arguments. But every time I teach my students, when I teach my Middle East politics module about, you know, labor uprisings in Egypt, in Turkey, in Tunisia, their initial response is always, how come they had, you know, strong labor unions in the 1960s and 70s? Because we were led to believe that labor unions only came with capitalism, and capitalism wasn't something that actually existed in the Middle East until, you know, mid to even late 20th century. So some of these initial ways of thinking about or conceptualizing capitalism in the Ottoman Empire unfortunately created this really, I think, distorted ways of thinking about modern economies in the Middle East, particularly in Turkey, but also in places like Egypt and Syria, which are often understood from the prism of late 19th, early 20th century political economy rather than their contemporary practices.
Thank you, Burak. So I am checking the questions, and there are very good questions. So quite a challenging one for Burak. Shall I go with you, Burak?
Right.
So Yazid Zahta is saying, Burak, you said that you're attempting to understand capitalism from a decentering approach. Looking at some of your work on authoritarian neoliberalism, you have analyzed neoliberalism nonetheless from an inherently Euro-Western epistemological lens. How do you reconcile these two opposing stances in the framework you have presented on decentering research?
Okay, thanks, Yazid. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what do you mean by analyzing neoliberalism from an inherently European lens?
Okay, so I think we need time for this, and while maybe Yazid is typing some elaborate explanation of it, we can move to another question. Senem, you wanted to turn back to Nora's question about how to decenter Europe without empowering other centers such as Ankara with their own hegemonic agendas. Do you want to maybe say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've answered that to some extent, but I mean, I can go on and on, obviously. so that's fine. Well, I mean, we try to do that in this. We have another article that we're working on, where we try to see how, for instance, we can establish a research agenda in which we can study the current uses of history by these populist, authoritarian, etc. movements in Turkey and elsewhere, right? So basically, again, unpack history, unpack historical narratives, show their contestation, but then also combine it with the present and show how they're instrumentalized, right? So to do that, of course, we've been working a lot with critical historiography. And so this becomes a very interdisciplinary research. So I think if this is a concern as such, then one should remain solid on the historical ground. And that's why, for instance, we're working with one of our colleagues who also worked with me and Bahar at this Horizon project, Alperen Topaz, who's an Ottoman historian. So we go into the primary texts, we look at and unpack all those primary texts and try to understand how, for instance, 19th century relationships between Turkey and the Ottoman Empire at the time was in fact represented by the political actors at the time. And how the uses of that 19th century history, because in current Turkish Euroscepticism or anti-Westernism, it's all about, if you go back to that contemporary discourse, it's all about 19th century and whatever's happened in 19th century, right? It's all about 100 years of suffering on the part of Turks or this and that. And you go and unpack that, and you contest that, and you contest that, and you see that you can actually destruct all that claim to identity that's being made by a certain reading or interpretation of certain events that in fact took place in the 19th century, who were never perceived as such in the 19th century. So it's possible, but it requires, I think, primary research. It requires more engagement with that. It requires constant reflexive sort of thinking about those so-called historical truths and what not to take as granted. And also it requires an engagement with contemporary discourse as well, because otherwise it's very easy to fall into the trap of, you know, yeah, well, Europeans tell the story as such, and this is what, I don't know, the Turks have been saying it, or Turkish historians have been saying it. That is not the way to go about it, because there are certain biases involved in all. So yeah, that's how I could answer that, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Senem. And there are also other questions. Burak, do you want to follow on this?
Yeah, can I just come in quickly? I think Nora's question is, yeah, absolutely fantastic. And one way maybe we can mitigate that risk of, you know, replacing one form of centrism, let's say, you know, ethnocentrism or autocentrism, with another is to focus on the, I think, the experiences and the perspectives of subaltern actors. Most of what we do as political scientists and international relations scholars is to look at the role of elite actors. And I think, you know, if you want to move away from a Eurocentric account by now reproducing, let's say, an Ankara-centric account, is you want to make sure that you're not actually prioritizing the perspective of the elite actors in Ankara. So I think a more kind of subaltern-focused approach could go some way in terms of mitigating that risk, even though there are obviously challenges to doing so. Most of all, practical challenges. How do you actually prioritize the voices of, you know, ordinary actors? How do you prioritize the everyday experience? That is a methodological question, and it's a difficult one. But I think it is preferable to the alternative, which is the focus we have on elite actors.
Yeah, thank you, Burak. There are other questions, but I think some of them have already been answered when you were answering my questions and other questions as well. But I want to ask a question about your reflections on potential areas and questions for doing decolonial, post-colonial research on European-Ottoman relations, because there are not many people who are working on this, right? I know you, I know Burak and Kerem Nishancıoğlu from SOAS. You are working on the Ottoman origins of capitalism. But yeah, what other areas can we maybe divert our attention to?
Shall I go first?
Yes, Senem.
Well, I mean, you know, it is a field that just keeps on giving and giving. That's what I can say, because once you get into it, and so I would encourage anybody who's interested in going into that to go into it, in the sense that, I mean, I have noticed in my own personal experience that often one set of research or question, as I was doing my research on that, it inspired me to work on another question. It really unpacked the way in which I see certain things, and I myself even take certain things as granted in my own way. For instance, one other area which we are focusing on or thinking about is when you talk about decentering Europe, for instance, one issue also is the fact that when you look at how Europe is always, or in the field of European studies, the critique or reflexive stance of European history often, you know, touches upon the Holocaust, or, you know, one or two issues that after this, just before the Second World War and afterwards, but not, for instance, Europe's imperialism or colonialism, or not even the Cold War years, right? And for instance, you know, when people talk about EU's normative identity, etc., nobody looks at how in the Cold War years, for instance, or even in late 19th century, certain tumultuous, you know, and perhaps pro-democratic changes in countries like Turkey and elsewhere has just gone unnoticed and even basically shunned and unencouraged by Europe, right? I mean, all these things are just not studied, or not studied sufficiently, right? Or in depth. I was just mentioned in passing. So in my sense, you know, I mean, in my understanding, once you kind of try to shift or change your conceptual take on this, about this, you know, history is being critically told, then I think it is possible to come up with new areas of research. And in my opinion, another issue or another field which I think is interesting and where this can be put to use is, for instance, in the current world, the way in which normative claims are being made by actors like Russia, Turkey, and even to some extent by China. They play the game of normativity, again, often with recourse to history. I think that's also important because that's also changing to some extent the language and discourse of IR as well. So that's a certain intervention on their part to this whole norms debate. So one could, again, approach these topics from the literature on norms or norm contestation, etc. And I think they would see interesting stuff out there.
Thank you, Senem. Burak, do you have anything to add to it? And Yazid also sent an elaborated explanation of what is meant by the previous question. And do you want to also address this?
Sure. Yeah. So I fully want to echo Senem's answer, but I also want to clarify that I don't think I'm doing post-colonial or decolonial research. To be honest, I am influenced by post-colonial scholars, and I'm reading and I'm trying to learn more from decolonial approaches and Black feminism. But in my own research, I don't necessarily think that I've managed to bring sufficient amount of insight from those different approaches. So I still regard myself as a bit of a unreconstructed historical materialist. So if you genuinely want to read a post-colonial and decolonially influenced account of these questions that we're discussing, you should definitely go and read Kerem Nişancıoğlu's work, Beste you already mentioned, and especially his most recent stuff on race and sovereignty. And he engages with the Ottoman Empire as well. It's probably one of the areas where we as international relations scholars, political economy scholars, can do more in terms of unpacking the racialization and othering that the Middle East has inherited perhaps from the Ottoman Empire. That could be an interesting way to move forward some of these discussions, I think.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Burak.
That's fine. I think some people are asking about the author, so maybe we can send them an email afterwards with a short reading list if people are interested.
Yeah, sure.
Kerem's piece, yes.
Yeah. So maybe we can just send the attendees a short bibliography. So in terms of the question on neoliberalism, so let me clarify outright that my understanding of neoliberalism is not that neoliberalism in Europe is somehow democratic and is based on free markets, and neoliberalism in other parts of the world are authoritarian. That's not what we mean by authoritarian neoliberalism. The entire projects on authoritarian neoliberalism that I've been working with, people like Imbrov, it actually emerged from a critique of the European Union and a critique of, liberal democratic management of capitalism in Europe. So the focal point of our critique is not necessarily Turkey or Egypt, it's actually Europe. But we also think that those practices have been adopted, especially in terms of executive centralization, this increasing reliance and concentration of power in the executive branch. They're being adopted by countries all across the world. So this is not something specific to Europe or the Middle East. So just to kind of go back to that question, let me clarify, and if you still have any doubts about that, I don't think neoliberalism in Europe is democratic and it's authoritarian in the Middle East. I think it's authoritarian everywhere. But I think it is still important to qualify what we mean by the authoritarian characteristic and practices of neoliberalism. And that's what I try to do in my own work in relation to Turkey and Egypt. And there are other colleagues who are working on Mexico, on European Union, on Spain and Italy. So it is not a geographically confined concept by any means.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Burak. Senem,
can I add something, Beste? Yeah, I just want to add, since there was also a question about this incorporating these stories and alternative storytelling to these narratives. I would also have a suggestion for those who are interested in that kind of work to go and read Zeynep Gülşah-Çapan, because she's been working a lot with these alternative histories and stories debate from an IR perspective, from an historical IR perspective. I'm just going to write her name now in the chat. I can do that, right? Okay, so you can just check out her book and also her articles. I think they would be super relevant.
Yeah, thank you, Senem. Definitely. I'm also following Gülşah's work very closely, and she has recently also published a great piece in International Studies Review on some of the questions that we have discussed. So we have reached the end of our session, but because we started a bit late, maybe I can ask you one final question. Is it okay for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question by Hanna Mühlenhoff about conditionality and EU's conditionality. So how can we critically analyze the EU's policies towards Turkey in terms of the EU's conditionalities for economic and political transformation from such a post-colonial approach? And for Burak, it's a post-colonial approach to capitalism.
Can I redirect that question to Senem, since she's the EU expert? I feel like I'm not really well qualified to answer that question properly. I mean, I can try, Hannah. You know, thanks for the question, but I think Senem could probably give a much more insightful answer.
I'm not so sure of that. I mean, for economic political, I'm looking at the question now. From a post-colonial, I mean, EU's conditionality for economic political transformation and capitalism. No, I don't think I'm going to go into that, Beste. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that there has been any research done on, yeah, as you say, Nora Fisher has done research on EU foreign policy from a decentering approach. And then this has been used in the study of migration, for instance, by Nora El-Kadim. However, in EU enlargement policy, I'm not familiar with any work, and maybe we can come back to our reflections on future research, and that might be the area that a decolonial, post-colonial perspective can be utilized.
Yeah. Perhaps there is. I don't know, Beste. Yeah, one should look it up. I'm not sure. Not that I'm aware of, but perhaps we missed something. I don't know. So there's been so much criticism together. Yeah, I mean, there's just so much criticism of EU conditionality in Turkey from, in terms of credibility, in terms of consistency, in terms of usual technical standards, but conceptually speaking, from a, from the perspective of capitalism and neoliberalism, I mean, it feels like there must be something, but because it's so obvious, right, at some level, but I don't know, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, if someone knows of any work on this, maybe you can send us an email, and then we can also share information with others. Well, thank you so much, Senem and Burak. It has been a pleasure to host you. Thanks to the audience with very great questions. So I want to finish with an announcement for our next panel, which will be next Wednesday, July the 8th. And it will be moderated by my colleague Tasnim Anwar, and we will speak with Dr. Sara Salem from the London School of Economics about her new book, Anti-Colonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony. So we hope to see many of you next week. And I want to also remind you that we have a newsletter. You can subscribe to our newsletter. So we will have 5 sessions, and this was the 3rd session before the summer break, but we will continue after summer. So if you want to be updated about what we are planning after the summer, this newsletter is for you. And follow us on Twitter and check our webpage, the ACES webpage. Once again, thank you so much for being with us, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.